And so, for those tuning in, this is Claire Avelina, and this is the In Circle podcast. I'm here with my dear friend Ben Cerezo, who has been such an inspiration for me in terms of good men's work. And Ben and I actually met in a transformational plant medicine ceremony, which was such a beautiful way to recognize that there are good men doing the inner work that is required to show up in integrity in the world. And over the years, I've just been able to see the ways that you've touched other men in our circles, in our network. And I'm also aware that you have been involved in facilitating a men's group for 8 years, or at least like a part of men's work for 8 years.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's been a good journey. Yeah, it started about 8 years ago. I started taking a good look at myself, how I was showing up in the world. Recognized I needed some sort of a shift, and started leaning in. Actually, first got involved in Mankind Project. Super transformative experience. Was introduced to men's circles at that point for the first time. Didn't even really know it was a thing. And then a couple of years after that, I moved out of the circle that I had started with that group and co-founded another one about 2 years later. So about 6 years in now to a men's group. We call ourselves the Wizards. We're about 8 strong at the moment. And really just continued to be a strong backbone for myself. Having this community of men holding me accountable to the way I show up in the world, and vice versa. Us really just kind of holding each other and calling each other out when we're not being our best selves, and also learning how to be better in the world and holding each other accountable to that. Yeah.
That's so good. And surprisingly, somewhat of a rare resource for us Americans in our culture. Like, I recognize that the technology of women's and men's circles, or just like gathering in circle in general, to create intimate, safe space where we can reflect, grow, evolve in conjunction with partnership and alliance with other people, that has been happening for a millennium in so many different cultures, but has been forgotten, right? So it's technically an ancient technology coming together in those kinds of constellations and intentions, but we're remembering, right? And there's been so much cultural fracturing of like forgetting what it means and what is required in order to have structures like that, where we can organize safe circles for us to come together. So I totally commend you for the commitment that you've held. And it sounds like, from what I've heard previously, like it's been the same, generally 8 men that have been pretty consistent over the years. Is that true?
It's actually rotated quite a bit. So over that, so it was like a 6-year period in this particular group. And we actually started off really small. So it was started by myself and two other men. And one fell off, 2 more came in, really just based on reference and us out in the world talking about, this men's group. It's like, hey, I'm curious about that. How can I get involved? And then there's space and we invite them in. And at this point, we've actually have a pretty good rhythm of things where we make a commitment at the beginning of each quarter. So solstice to equinox, can you commit to showing up 80% of the meetings during this period? And then if so, and you want to, then yes. If not, we respectfully request that you bow out and you can come in the next one. And it's been really great because it gives us the continuity and the structure that we need in order to show up and continue, have a trajectory of growth throughout that period of time, without like, am I seriously going to be giving up my Tuesdays every we're 2 weeks on, 1 week off, but are we seriously giving up like this consistent day of my life, like for the next 5 years in order to sit with you guys? That's a long time. But allows us to be flexible there. And like, if we need a break or if we have other things in life that call to us where we need to put our attention, we do that. And folks have exercised that, and they've left and they've come back, and it's really starting to create more of an extended community, which is nice. Yeah.
And that consistency is so important because it creates safety.
Critical. Yeah.
Yeah. And for those that aren't familiar with circle work, because again, this is somewhat new for a lot of people. Typically the structure, at least in my experience with like facilitating women's circles and red tents, we create the opportunity for people to really just tap into their hearts together. And it can be therapeutic in a more casual way of being able to just relate to one another's stories, what's alive for each one of us. And I would imagine, especially with like the experience of men in particular in our culture, having that consistency of that you can trust and you personally know intimately well the people that you're in circle with allows people to go deeper.
Right. And the more you get to know somebody in a circle like that, the more you get to recognize their shadow. So when it pops out and they don't see it, then, maybe I see it. Maybe somebody else in the group sees it. And we can ask them to take a look at it. It's like, hey, is it you mean to show up this way? Is this something that's really in integrity with how you want to show up? And it gives the person in question the opportunity to like really look at that.
Right. Because we all have our blind spots, but with emotional maturity, we can also like highlight those blind spots for each other in a way that's serving and not critical.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's one of the blocks that some people might have to entering into a circle of that type, because I observe that sometimes folks might feel intimidated of like opening up vulnerably and like being seen in their full spectrum. And ultimately, what these circles are intended to do, if they're held right, is to be able to bring people more into themselves. Right.
Yeah. We intentionally don't have, we got rid of the phrase calling out. It's like, hey, I'm calling you out. It's more like I'm calling you in. I'm calling you into the circle. I'm calling you into recognizing yourself in this too. And that holding of one another, that trust that is built in the group allows us to see the callings in, the critical pointings out of how we show up as something that's ultimately supportive for ourselves on our personal path, rather than as something that's meant to be like shaming or trying to instill guilt. Like, we get enough of that. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And so a big intention for me in bringing us together for this conversation is to explore the question that so many women consistently lament on of where are the good men? We hear this all the time, at least me and my experience of the feminine world. It's a very common question that women are exhausted by. And our culture also really reaffirms that in terms of the way that I'm perceiving men's work, women's work, every human's work. We're all deconstructing from what I call programs that, in a sense, are installed by our culture and our societal upbringings that tell men to operate in a certain way, women to operate in a certain way. And again, I'm just speaking from the binary in general for generalization to speak on like the culture as a whole, but this can apply to all people and all identities. And we all have masculine and feminine within us that we get to dance with. But primarily for those that identify as men and women, when we look at what those identities have been defined by in our culture, they can come with conditions or behaviors that are expected of us that aren't necessarily healthy, but have been so normalized. And so these spaces like men's circles or women's circles, we get to reflect on how we are operating as individuals and what's actually serving us. And we get to reclaim our sovereignty a bit in terms of what what actually works for me, what actually feels true in terms of who I am and who I want to be, and what are some of those cultural programs that I've been installed with as a woman or a man that doesn't actually feel good, but I have been told is how I should be. And I think that's where a lot of women get frustrated in terms of like, where are the good men? Because when we look at how men in America have been culturally programmed in a sense, a lot of those behaviors that are really normal in terms of like how men are taught to be masculine in our current day and age, a lot of women are disappointed by. And that's why like they look around and they're like, why are all the men operating in this way that feels toxic, right? And so I really commend the work of men's circles being held in like a heart-centered way where like we can really, I like to think of it as like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, right? And being able to really look in the mirror of what are some of these patterns that like I'm unconsciously and automatically operating in, and does this actually serve the women in my life, the relationships that I want to have, the ways that I want to show up as a masculine person in the world? So yeah, I just think overall creating those safe spaces and conversations like this can be a really helpful way to constructively deconstruct.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. Something you said reminded me. It's like, yeah, there is this conditioning. There's this way that we in the U.S. tend, and a lot of other like civilized places around the world where we tend to see masculinity show up. Tends to be dominating, tends to be controlling, tends to there's this feeling of empowerment or righteousness that isn't really granted by others necessarily. It's something that really is wells up from the ego. And it's something that's demonstrated to us, to all of us. So it's the messaging. It's like, it's what women see in the world, and it's what they experience the masculine to be, but it's also what the masculine, what other men see the masculine is expected to be too. So it's actually setting an example for other men that, hey, this is how you need to show up in order to be safe, in order to be strong, in order to be seen in the way that others perceive you in a masculine body. So to step outside of that, it really can put a man at risk, or a feeling of being at risk, to not show up in this like typically masculine way of what's expected today. And I experienced that quite a bit growing up. And it's something that I didn't really identify with. Like I would see a lot of these toxic behaviors growing up, and it always felt really weird. It was like, no, it's totally okay to grab her ass at a party. It's like thinking back to like, okay, I was like in my like late teens, 20s, that sort of thing. And it was like, no, this is totally okay to do because you see it done.
And it's encouraged.
Yeah, by like other guys, by other friends. You see it in movies or whatever. And then there's this backlash, that happens. It's like, no, you don't do that. I'm like, oh, I remember a specific moment, that happened for me. And, I mean, I myself developed a fear really of other men out there in the world. Seeing other men behave this way, it just created a lot of dissonance for me. That ended up being really confusing. And
right, because if you're told by your men's, like your peers, your boys that like you hang out with, and they are reaffirming to you, this is the behavior you want to do to belong with us, to be accepted by us. But then when you do it, then you get hit by the like dissonance from the feminine. That's going to be really confusing.
Oh, totally. And it's like, you hang out the window and holler at girls.
Yeah.
It's really, really silly and sad that's the way things are. When I was first doing men's work, I remember having an experience of there being other men in the space too. So this is actually through Mankind Project. and they have an initiating weekend. It's called a New Warrior Training Adventure. Like, it's the sort of thing, like, you sign up, you buy the ticket, you take the ride. And it was such an amazing experience for me. And I remember going into that space, and I saw there's this one guy in particular, really huge dude, tattoos, long hair, like the sort of guy that I was like, I just don't want to mess with him. Immediately, like, just because of his appearance, right? I have all these judgments about him from my own conditioning. And like later on in the weekend, I saw him having a really kind of intense, raw moment, crying, like opening up his heart and being held by other men in a way that I've never seen before, and in a way that was really deeply healing for him. And immediately in that moment, I experienced this flip for me, from like this judgment to just like this compassion. Like I could see the little boy inside of him, just like the tenderness. And I recognized that little boy in me also, who just needs love and just needs acceptance. And, you know, over time, it's really helped me to see and recognize, or at least imagine, that men who actually project poor behavior out in the world, other men who act in inconsiderate ways towards anyone else, like women included, women probably primarily, what's underlying that is something that often can tend to be some unaddressed shadow aspect of themselves. Maybe there's something that was not met, a need that was not met, but they don't know another way to have that need met other than to act out through this masculine narrative that we're always told.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And when the masculine program, the way that I have been perceiving it, is a lot of times it pushes men into this archetype of being this like strong soldier, right? Of, I need to project my strength in a forceful, penetrative way to get what I want, to prove my worth. And that is what is defined as being a successful man in the world.
Right.
Like, you have to be domineering. And that's the perception of masculine power in a lot of ways. And when we see that in execution, that behavior can be really stifling to true connection, to true expression of one's authenticity. Because if a man is operating in this like strong, hardcore soldier type mentality, like, there's this disconnection from the heart wisdom of being clear and sovereign in who that person actually is. Like, there's walls and armor that get built up. And then again, that like fight response in order for them to feel validated.
Right. Right. Yeah. That fight response, it's like, it's defensive by deflecting. Yeah.
So I'm curious, in terms of your journey of unpacking masculinity, in terms of your own relationship to it and what led you to men's work, what have been some of the key contemplations or perhaps moments where you've really gotten a good grappling around your relationship with it?
Oh boy, let's see, my relationship with masculinity. Well, I mean, there's my dad. He was, he was a role model for me in a lot of ways. Had to do a lot of actually personal work around my relationship with my dad too. It's given me an opportunity. Well, I recognize, like, I can't go back and change ways that, people have been in the past, or like my dad, or like ways that I showed up. But what I can do is I can change the narrative moving forward. So, how do I show up towards my son? How do I show up towards my daughter in the world? So I've been able to take a lot of lessons there, learn, some of my dad's good traits, like how to show up and continue that, but then also things that were not so helpful, things that were not healthy. And then how can I transmute that? How can I show up towards my son and show him that actually being soft is good? Show him that being vulnerable and like listening to your heart and sharing what's on your heart is actually a sign of strength. I mean, there have even been moments like, I mean, I've seen him take this stuff to heart too, and even keep me in check in the process where, I'll show up in some domineering way. And, maybe he's like on his phone a lot or something. And I'm like, get off your phone. You need to get off your phone, which of course is kind of a valid thing. Like, you need to get off your phone. But the way in which I approached it was not really considerate over the fact that like maybe he's texting his like classmate about some homework stuff. And I'm just like, I see it on the surface and I get activated. And then he gets angry with me. He gets upset with me. And then it just turns into this big blow up.
Right, because he wasn't actually heard or considered for why he was on his phone.
Exactly.
But you're also trying to be a good dad.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And then in the aftermath of that, like he points out to me how I'm out of line. A lot of this men's work has been useful for me in being able to then just like recognize that like I don't have all the answers, that I actually need to listen to the people that are around me and what they are saying and what their truth is. And in so many instances, like reflecting back, I've shown up in life really assuming what people's truths are, what's going on for them, and then acting from a place of that assumption rather than showing up with curiosity. Hey, where are you on your phone right now? Instead of like, get off your phone. It's like just that one flip, that one showing up with curiosity is a really neat thing that I've learned as well. And even in any circumstance, it's really neat because just asking the question to somebody causes them to reflect on like, why am I doing this? And it can have the desired outcome of like, maybe I'm spending too much time on my phone and here's my truth. It circumvents the whole argument and it actually leads to deeper understanding and also more humility. And so that's another area where I feel like I've been able to show up for him is actually like accepting his criticism back towards me and showing him that I can do that, that I'm just not like, no, you're wrong. And it's just like butting heads all the time. But demonstrating to him that accepting critical feedback and incorporating that with humility and then coming back and admitting when I'm out of line is like a skill that I think just about everybody could benefit from.
Right. And there's a balance there between the emotional maturity and the nervous system regulation to be able to like hold that reflection and meet it and recognize that we all have our blind spots where none of us are perfect. Right. But we get to lean into the relationships where typically there would even be a power dynamic, father and son. Right. And like deconstruct those pedestals a little bit of like, we actually get to learn from one another here.
Right.
And something that I have been contemplating in terms of like my own identifications and definitions of like, what is a good man? What makes a good man? And one of the key pillars that has come out so far in my reflections of that as paramount is a good man is a man that listens. And listening, that curiosity is such a key. Because ultimately, if we're looking at the masculinity programming that we are installed in with our culture, a lot of times like men and boys are programmed into this idea that in order to be masculine, I must be strong, domineering, decisive, and what I say goes. I'm going to put my sword in the ground. And it can be that like penetrative force of I know what's right. Especially if like you are in a position of like authority or power, be it as a father or like in a position in like a workplace or anything like that. Like it's encouraged to be more so like, I know what's best and this is the law of the land versus let's get a little bit more curious. What actually serves the whole, right? Because that's also the archetype of the king and the patriarch in the exalted, clean, healthy way is one that serves all of the people within his realm.
Totally. And totally put the sword in the ground, like stake that place. Like that's a good thing to do. That's actually very masculine. The missing piece, I think, for so many today is to actually stop and ask and find out, how can I best serve through my leadership?
Right.
Rather than how can I dominate others by leading, which isn't really leading, it's commanding.
Yes.
It's false.
Yes. It's not leading, it's commanding.
Yeah.
That's so good. Especially something that I have really reflected on in terms of our Americans' perception of leadership and our perception of power has become really stigmatized. We've only really seen in most recent generations expressions of leadership and power, especially like held and expressed by masculine people in our culture as like being really commanding of like what I say goes. I'm like, and it's glorified, right? And ultimately, what healthy leadership is a responsibility to steward. Like you are trusted with leadership, power, and authority because you are someone that knows how to steward well. Steward your family, your community, your company, whatever it might be. That's what a good leader is.
Right. Right. And interestingly, the masculine is supported by the feminine in that.
Mm-hmm.
So, part of good leadership is not only cultivating the masculine of like, putting the sword in the ground, but also cultivating the feminine receptivity, the aspect of self who can listen, who can be soft, who can be curious, who can try to find understanding and create peace in the process. Because when that happens, the leadership is just natural. It just like flows. Right. It falls in. There's no forcing.
Mm-hmm. Right, which is if we look to archetypal stories and mythologies where we can see the archetypes of leadership, men, women as kings and queens, right? Like a lot of times in these beautiful stories that have informed humanity's evolution, we see like the king and the queen both having complementary leadership qualities that are uniquely different in their strengths, that inform and balance one another. And that union of both is what creates a happy kingdom, right?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And without the listening component in terms of women being able to listen to men and men being able to listen to women, I feel like that has just stewed so much conflict because both quote unquote sides feel like they're not being heard by one another.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm also curious in terms of like a general collective bird's eye view, what is your perception? And you can add anything here in terms of what do you perceive happening to men on a collective level? And we'll keep it within the scope of America.
Sure. I mean,
I know that's a huge question, but
that's my experiences in the U.S. Yeah, what's happening? I mean, we're like men are given so many messages about how to show up in the world, what it's like to be a man. I think we've talked a bit about this already, and it's an awful lot of pressure that happens. So just as women are conditioned over time to be, many are fearful of men, many have like reservations of men in power or not in power. I mean, there's so many archetypes of like toxic masculine, even like the form of masculine where it's like that abdicates power, that like gives up power to women to be like, whatever you say, dear, that sort of energy. It's also an abdication of the masculine in a way that is also toxic. So I think it's important to look at that, not just the domineering man, but the man who just rolls over and doesn't really have much of a backbone. It's finding that imbalance. And I think we just see examples of all of that. My initial, I'll kind of bring it back to me for a second. So as a way to illustrate this, because I think we see a lot of men out there too who maybe don't identify with the super strong masculine, but instead it's like, well, I'm not going to be that because obviously that's toxic. The next thing to do is to be a people pleaser and to do whatever people say. And that's gotten me in big trouble in the past too. And I see it a lot with a lot of men out there too. Societally, where where it's almost like you're either one or the other, you know, where you're trying to people please. But then that ends up, I mean, both of those things are an abdication of like listening to what's in your heart.
Right.
And maybe at the core of all of that, of what's going on with masculinity and how men show up in the world, is it's this universal quality of not being in touch with what's going on in your heart. So there's so many reasons for this. A lot of it is in daily practice, you know. I wrestle with this. Well, I shouldn't say wrestle with this, actually. I feel like I've finally reached a good flow with it, where I have a daily habit, a daily practice of like sitting down and being quiet and actually listening to my heart. You know, where is it that today I need to be spending my time? How do I need to be spending my focus? Where do I need to be paying more attention to the needs of the loved ones in my life and the people around me? And that yields really tremendous insight for me on a daily and continuous basis. Like, just that practice allows me to then walk into a business meeting. You know, I'm collaborating with a group of people. There's someone who's quiet in the space. You know, someone's not speaking up. Someone has like this expression where they feel like they're like made a little bit smaller. I will then be like, so what do you think? And then I help hold the space and help create the space for that. That's where I've seen, you know, I see that there's opportunities, I think, for men out there to do that, I guess, to elevate people's voices who don't really speak up, who don't feel like that they can share their opinion, that their space might not be safe. There's a lack of that generally, but I'm seeing it more and more, which gives me a lot of hope.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. That's such a good practice too, of, again, going back to listening and the curiosity. Like, for us to show up as leaders, it's our responsibility to make sure that everyone feels included and heard, because that's what creates informed leadership. And I also want to like touch on some of the cultural aspects in the spectrum that I feel like you just opened up in my mind, in terms of, ultimately, we each crave each other. Men and women crave each other. Like, there's that natural inclination to want to connect. And so for men and boys, the ways that they have been taught, at least from what I'm hearing, is there's kind of like this spectrum in terms of men and boys having this drive and desire to want to connect with women. And when men and boys feel a resistance towards the like toxic, domineering archetype of how they're taught to like be a man when they're young, they then go into that like soft, passive, submissive mode, and in attempt to like, you know, be the nice guy, right? But then in other ways, that also is shamed at a certain point, because yes, women want a good man, but then there's also culturally in dating shame around being too passive as a man. And I don't keep up with like slang terms, especially ones that are derogatory, but what brings to mind is the word simp, I think is what it's called, of like, it's a derogatory, shameful term to boys that are too passive. And it makes fun of like boys that, or men that like roll over for women in attempt for that connection. And then you can also see like, and I don't believe that women's culture is perfect by any means, but like we also see in like a lot of women's dating conversations culturally, like women saying that they want a good man, but they don't want a nice guy. Like nice men are boring.
Yeah.
Right. So then for men that are on that more like softer side of the spectrum, there's not a lot of clarity on how they can show up in connection with their hearts, connect with women, because then they still get shut down.
Right.
And then on the flip side of that spectrum, men can get resentful because they show up as the nice guy and then like come with flowers all the time and they still get shut down. And like, why does the girl I like only like bad boys?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's such a cultural trope. And then that's where the rise of people like Andrew Tate get really popular, who is a man who projects a lot of that intense toxic masculinity of like, okay, like don't be a simp,
Mm-hmm.
don't be passive, you got to be like really aggressive with women because that's actually what they want and what they respond to,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't believe. Like, let's just be clear.
Or maybe that's what they're used to.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and the things that we're used to, even if they're not, we talked about this earlier a little bit, the things that people are used to, even if it's toxic, oftentimes feel more comfortable. So it's a lot easier to fall into those habits, as unhealthy as they are, of things that are toxic, than it is to be in a situation where, like imagining like a man shows up like in a really good way, like he's a really great guy, but maybe it's with a woman who has not really experienced that before. It could be probably super disorienting. It's like, what is this person trying to do? Are they trying to like take advantage of me somehow? Are they not being honest? Like, when's the other shoe going to drop? And so here could be a perfectly great, respectable guy who would be a great match, but because he's showing up authentically in stark opposition to, a lot of other men who have shown up so aggressively, it can end up be like almost like this alien thing.
Right. It's like we cannot compute. Like, what do we do with this rare archetype, which like women ultimately want, but sometimes we don't even know how to recognize because we're so not used to it. Yeah, this reminds me, I saw a viral video. I think it was like going viral on TikTok or something, of this girl who went on a date and she was describing how she like set like a consent boundary with her date and was like, this is as far as I'll go. And then when he respected that, she was like upset. And she was like sharing about like how strange it was that like she was actually feeling upset that he didn't disrespect her, because she was not expecting that, when it's again so flipped in terms of like culturally, like women are craving respect from men, to be heard and seen and to like have their boundaries honored. But because we're not used to that, it's a shock to our systems.
Right. Well, as Eckhart Tolle said, attachment to our pain bodies is a real thing.
Yeah, and also like the capacity and regulation of our nervous systems to recognize in those moments when something is hard for us to hold and to get curious about it, right? Instead of like putting up that armor of like, okay, like I just need to stick with men that disrespect me because that's what I'm used to. Like, can I get more curious around this and deconstruct that armor in the first place?
Right. Yeah, super important. There's something actually that occurred to me I wanted to share with you about this idea off of you. Occurred to me a little while ago, just about men in relationship, and how men are raised in this world, and then how that translates into how they show up in a relationship. I think a lot of boys are raised, being naturally expressive, naturally curious, playful, tender, wanting to cuddle, like all that good stuff. And then there comes a point when they reach an age where it's like, it's kind of weird. It gets weird, and then so you have here a young man who really wants love and affection tenderly, but then now it doesn't really have access to it. They maybe been raised with it. It's been very nurturing. Now they're cut off from it at this age where they're like really stepping into their bodies as they're maturing and everything. Then, a lot of that expression and everything just goes internal, almost goes dormant. I think this happens a lot. And then they have a girlfriend, and they realize that, she listens to me. Oh, and I'm getting laid. And then so those two things go hand in hand oftentimes. And so then what happens is you get this pattern instilled that emotional intimacy equals sex.
Oof. Good point.
And so then if I'm not getting sex, I'm not having emotional intimacy anymore. And all of the complexity that comes with that. So if men don't have a place or a way socially to connect with others, like any gender, about what's going on for them emotionally, and they have emotional intimacy and sex conflated so hard, then they're only going to be emotionally connected then with their sexual partners. And they're not going to really have the benefit of a broader community supporting them working through their hard stuff.
Right.
And then they're also going to be getting hyper-focused on their partners as far as the only person who can really fulfill this level of emotional fulfillment for them, which is a huge burden to put on somebody else in a partnership. Yes. And I recognize that women take on a lot of that burden on behalf of guys who get really close to them too, which is just another like little chalk mark for like men's groups are really great because you can basically be held by other men in that space and learn to be vulnerable around other men. That's why it's super important. Yeah.
That is such a good point, because on the flip side of the woman's experience of that, I can definitely speak for myself, and I know many other women have had this experience too, of like, I was just being nice and now he likes me, you know, or like I was just being nice and like listening to him and now he wants to hook up. Like that happens so much. And like I've talked with so many women about that same contemplation of like balancing that dance of like not wanting to engage with someone intimately in that physical way, but like anytime that we open up the heart, it's so rare for men and boys to feel that. And again, there's this association of like, if I can feel this heart connection, then therefore it must mean this. And it gets confusing. So I just recognize that as like a huge block in communication between men and women.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it totally made friendships I've had growing up way more complicated than it needed to be.
Right. Yeah, because we think that if there's like emotional safety, then therefore it must mean that there's romance now.
Right.
Yeah. And I can even speak to some of my best friends ever in my life, like the closest pillars have always been masculine people. And so often people like cannot compute that like a man and a woman can platonically be really close friends. They're like, there must be something else going on here. It's like, actually, this is possible. And it's actually really beautiful and healthy. Like when we get to connect as different gendered experiences and have that emotional intimacy enough to like grow and evolve and play with one another in a way that's not sexual or like physical at all.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, it's really important to be able to practice that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really hard for boys growing into men who, who have that experience. I mean, it's, the world we live in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think a question that a lot of women chew on is they want to feel any amount of safety with men, whether it's like a brother or a friend or someone that they're romantically interested in. Like we want to feel that safety. And something that I've been really contemplating is like, how can we identify when a man is safe, when a man is a good man, right? And like, obviously it's an individual case by case basis, so it's nearly impossible to generalize that. But from someone who has done a lot of inner and outer men's work, can you identify any green flags in terms of like, how do you identify as a man when a man is a good guy?
Yeah. Well, does he follow up on commitments? Mm-hmm. Does he listen? Does he listen and not only say like, yes, I hear you, or even someone with some tools like nonviolent communication tools, like they're good reflective listeners. Great. That's awesome. Mm-hmm. But do they follow through? Do do their actions actually reflect what they're saying? I think that's really critical, and it's subtle, but it's important to pay attention to that. It can be sometimes really hard to identify that too. So again, I think getting quiet, spending time to get quiet and really reflecting on that and listening to your heart, I think is a really good key for that. But yeah, the integrity piece. Gosh, how's his relationship with his mom? Oh. That's another good one. Yes. Yeah, how's his relationship with his mom? Yeah, is he friends with his exes?
And what kind of friendship does that look like?
Yeah, totally.
Is it still sticky?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or is it a secretive relationship with his exes?
Or is it actually genuinely respectful and a genuine friendship that you can see?
Yeah.
Those are such good points. Something that's come up for me, and at least one of the green flags that I've identified as a woman, is how does my nervous system feel when I'm around them? And there takes a lot of internal, subtle fine-tuning in terms of being able to identify that, especially like in the moment of like being able to tune in to like the somatic body and the nervous system, like especially in the moment when you're engaging with someone directly. But I notice that men that I feel so relaxed in, and I feel like I can really just like automatically be my authentic self without like posturing, that's always a good sign, at least in my practice. If I feel like if I notice myself like needing to like contort a little bit, or like even like accommodate them in a certain way to make them feel more comfortable, and like I can't fully relax, that's usually a flag for me to like just like tread a little bit more lightly. But in terms of your experience in men's work in general, I am curious to understand more what some of your takeaways have been over the last 8 years of diving into men's work. How has your journey of diving into creating those structures looked like? What are some of the challenges that you faced in terms of creating opportunities for men to come together to do this work in a good way?
That's a good question. I mentioned at the beginning, like we were just a couple of guys at first. I think finding a good rhythm is really, really difficult. Like number one, getting people to commit is hard. And then also not like focusing on a particular outcome. So like there's a perseverance aspect of it. Like even when it's like 3 dudes in a fire in the cold rain in my backyard, legit, we did that for a while. Like what's the level of perseverance and grit that you can have to show up to like express in crappy weather, like what is the stuff you're dealing with? And finding the people who can roll with that is tricky. It's really hard. I think, identifying a good schedule rhythms, this is all kind of like logistical stuff, but like a good schedule rhythm that works for everybody, that's another kind of thing to overcome. Around consistency as well. But then even beyond that, I think a willingness to try new things, to, finding people who are like willing to be in uncomfortable situations. That's almost like a prerequisite, I think, at least in the circles that I've been in. Yeah. And lately it's really been finding a balance of a structure that works for everybody. So I would say like the group I'm in its present state right now is like, we are so focused on like, we've got this machine, like how can we fine tune it? And it's like, it's almost like a laser sharp focus. Like we're like doing little tweaks each quarter. Like, how do we structure it? Okay. Like somebody has a problem with it. Too bad. We got to commit. We got to see it through. And then if you don't like it, then you lead the next quarter. And, so passing the leadership around is really good. So I think it really boils down to just that willingness to commit, and then also the willingness of people to find tools to go out and identify like what are some new exercises or techniques or practices that we can bring in. Yeah, did that answer your question? Cool.
I love the point about the tools, because something that I have heard and observed from other young men that I know who have experienced men's circles or have tried to start their own is a common challenge that they've expressed is men having so much emotional armor that they feel blocked to be able to open up. And I have had like masculine friends share with me that they like attempted a men's circle and like no one wanted to talk, right? And obviously you have the rapport and the trust with your current constellation of men. And I recognize that there are really important tools that we can like equip ourselves with to feel that emotional skill, to regulate and open up in intimacy at the same time. And I'm curious if you have any reflections or maybe even like tips in terms of men that might feel that like emotional blockage and like armoring. Like how can they start to soften?
Yeah. No, that's really great. There are a couple of opening exercises that we move through actually. Helps us drop into our heart. Whenever we start each circle, we do start with a meditation of some kind, a grounding meditation. Lately I've been leading meditations on the heart and listening to the heart and opening that and hearing what has to say. And then we go around and we share. It's like nobody skips, but that's the prompt is like settle and listen to your heart. What is your heart telling you like right now? Could be anything. There's some exercises too around relating that I found to be really powerful. An eye gazing exercise, and where everybody just spends time looking into each other's eyes deeply, no expression, just hold it, and then recognizing in yourself, like, do you have a charge with this person? Do you have a judgment about them? Is it like, it could be positive or it could be negative. It's like, this dude is fucking awesome. Like, I get to hang out with you. Like, that's a charge, just as much as like, oh, dude, I know you've been cheating on your girlfriend. That's also a charge. And I have judgments about you as a person and how you show up in the world because this is what you're doing. That's also a charge. And so recognizing those is good. And so actually an exercise that we do every so often, I would say for new groups, important to do like at the start of every circle, which is what I did actually at the beginning of my groups, is we would do this eye gazing, and then we would all come and sit down and be like, does someone have a charge with somebody else in this group? Put your hand up. And then
That's a lot of honesty.
It's a lot of honesty, and it's very demanding, but honestly, this kind of work, that's what it demands. Like
right.
you have to do that. You have to be willing to step into this, because or else what else are you doing? Like, do you just want to dance around on the surface, or do you want to actually know yourself? Do you want to actually like that? That's actually the nature of the work. So yeah, it's challenging. It's jumping in the deep end, but you're a man. That's what you do. So
you're going for the jugular.
You're going for it. Yeah, you're going for it. And then if you do, there's actually a really beautiful process for resolving that too. So like when I recognize I have a charge with somebody else, I call it out. I was like, yeah, I have a charge with you. And then I state it, and then I'm given the opportunity to process it. And it's a little bit more advanced, so I won't necessarily go into the details at this point. I would say if anyone's curious, like, I learned this technique through Mankind Project, but I'm sure you can probably learn it in other places too. But there's a facilitated process for really clearing that charge. I will give you a little bit of a sneak peek though. Little spoiler on this is that typically any judgment I have about somebody else is actually a judgment that I have about myself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh.
So if I recognize something in somebody else that I really don't like, or something that I really do like, it tends to correlate pretty closely with some other judgment I have about myself too. So there's actually a window. So it's important to recognize that, like, yes, it's really challenging to be like, I have a judgment about you or because of this thing. It's a key. It's a door for opening up myself to deeper understanding for what's going on in my heart. And so we all, by gathering in circles, serve each other by working as mirrors for one another.
Or even if I have a charge around what someone else is embodying, maybe that's actually something that I want to embody more of.
Yeah.
And like, that's why I'm feeling that charge or that resistance or even jealousy.
Yeah.
Right? I love that so much. Thank you so much for breaking that down, even just a little bit of a teaser.
Yeah.
And I know that you are feeling inspired to even explore your own podcast realms of the transformational tools that have supported you and other people. And so I'm excited for that to come out whenever that's ready.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And I know that you've also hosted like kind of like open circles for people to come visit your constellation of men's work and get to know the structures that people can take like what you've learned in practice as a facilitator and apply it to their own circles. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So we hosted our first open circle last year, I guess, and we have another one that's coming up where, this quarter we've been looking at how we can be more of service in the world, which I think is an important part of showing up in the masculine is, of course, being of service. So, to that, we're exploring next quarter, hosting an open circle as well, co-ed this time as well, so that men and women could show up. I can't even tell you how many women I've heard who have like, how do you do what you do? Is like, I want to get together with women, but I think there's just as much of a storyline about women that other women internalize about women too.
Right.
On the flip side, that ends up being a barrier to wanting to connect deeply and being able to benefit or get the benefit of circling in community like that too. So wanted to really just open up that group. It's not like eye gazing is like a strictly men's thing, right? It's like, it's something that anybody can do. Even in co-ed groups, I've never sat in a co-ed circle like that, but that'd be kind of interesting. But in a gendered group like that, we look forward to sharing how we run our circles logistically and then emotionally as well, sharing some stories of things that maybe we've experienced, and then leaving anybody who comes and joins us for this with a set of tools for creating their own group or starting to form their own group as well over time, because it's really important that people have access to doing this kind of work, and it's tricky to start at square one and just be like, so all right guys, should we crack a beer and watch the game now? Because that's the kind of circle that happens most of the time,
and that's what we're used to.
Yeah,
but it sounds like you are offering the model that your group has refined so that people can plug in, essentially reap the harvest that you've already worked so far on in terms of like doing men's work and holding these types of circles, and then they get to take it home and apply it for themselves, which is just such a service. So thank you for that offer alone.
Yeah, totally. Hopefully people do it. It's important. And it's like, I'm not going to do the men's group for you. It's like everybody needs to take responsibility for creating their own lives,
and there can't be enough of them. Like, there's like, 8 billion people on the planet. And ultimately the circles are strongest when they're intimate, smaller.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's so empowering to be able to like equip people directly with the tools that they might benefit from. So thank you for that. And thank you for all of the insights that you've shared today. That's been super, super juicy. And if any folks want to connect with Ben, come to his open circle or just like learn more about him and his work, I will link him in the podcast description. And yeah, just want to thank you so much for spending this time to chat with me. It's just such a treat to drop in with you.
Super great. Thanks so much, Claire.
Yeah.
Love you so much.
Love you too. More to come.
Cool.
Yay.
Yeah.